The past tenses in Italian come from Latin, which had a set of synthetic past forms. As spoken Latin evolved into Romance languages, these synthetic forms began to lose clarity in everyday speech. To compensate, speakers started reinforcing past meaning by combining a verb of possession or state, that is, an auxiliary verb, and a verbal adjective, that is, a past participle. This pattern emphasized time and completion with one action, and over time, two auxiliary verbs survived because they served different semantic purposes. The division between the verbs later became part of the grammar, especially in Italian. So in the language, compound past forms became true verb tenses, consisting of auxiliary verbs avere, to have, essere, to be, and past participles. The focus of avere is on performed actions, while essere is about the state or result of an action. When it comes to learning Italian past tenses, many of them have the prossimo form, and its original function is about completed actions that are still connected to the present, thereby making a compound tense form. Even today, Italian compound tenses are dominant in speech. In these lessons, I will explain every Italian past tense individually, along with how to form and when to use each one. In the beginning, it's good to learn the origin of the Italian past tenses so that later auxiliaries and agreements become simple. Let's begin with the simple compound past, known in Italian as passato prossimo. This tense is the most common in Italian speech, which is historically a reinforced past and a compound tense that is tied to completion. Now, it's important to see the core structure of the tense, having two elements: an auxiliary verb, avere, essere, and a past participle. Think of it as the English present perfect, but in Italian, the focus is on completed past actions. We should know that only the auxiliary verb is conjugated for person and number, while the past participle is fixed in form. But there is a major rule that I will show later. Because the auxiliary is conjugated, we have to see the conjugations of avere and essere in the present indicative. These are the conjugations that we will need in the tense. Ho, hai, ha, abbiamo, avete, hanno, sono, sei, è, siamo, siete, sono. As always, we don't need to say the subject pronouns, because the conjugations are sufficient. For now, we know the first element of the passato prossimo, the auxiliary verb. The second element is the past participle, which carries the lexical meaning of the verb. For now, I will show the formation of regular participles so that we can see how to form sentences in this tense. Later, I will explain irregular participles separately. To form Italian past participles, we consider the endings of infinitives: are, ere, ire. Let's use the verbs parlare, credere, dormire. To make participles out of the verbs, we drop the infinitive endings and add the following endings: atto for are verbs, utto for ere verbs, and ito for ire verbs. Now we have past participles: parlato, creduto, dormito. After learning the first element, we now know the second element, which is the past participle. By putting the elements together, we can make simple sentences with other verbs. Ho parlato. Hai mangiato. Ha studiato. Abbiamo letto. Hanno finito. Sono arrivato. Sei partito. È entrata. Siamo tornati. Sono rimaste. These are basic phrases in the passato prossimo. When it comes to translating them, a sentence like ho parlato can mean both I spoke, simple past, and I have spoken, present perfect. In English, the phrases separate depending on context, but Italian has one tense for both concepts, signifying a completed action in the past, whether it was just now or back in time. In these examples, you might have noticed that the participles don't change with avere, but with essere, some modifications happen. This is done so that the words match the subject based on person and number, thereby creating agreement, which I will emphasize later. After learning the main structure of the tense, we can now see irregular participles in agreement. Irregular participles exist in Italian because they come directly from Latin perfect forms and older verbal adjectives. They survived because they belonged to high-frequency verbs, which were not regular. For this reason, there is no specific system for them, so we have to recognize some of their patterns and memorize them. Of course, knowing all irregular participles is impossible, so as a rule of thumb, it's better to see the most commonly used participles whose patterns somewhat help, because they end in to, so, or sto. Once again, there is no fixed pattern for irregular participles, so we simply memorize them. Stato, avuto, fatto, detto, visto, preso, messo, rimasto, venuto, tenuto, dato, scritto, letto, aperto, chiuso, scelto, bevuto, vissuto, morto. After seeing many irregular participles, we now have to understand participle agreement, and this is where Italian highly deviates from English, which can be a difficult concept. An agreement happens between the subject and the past participle, but the key question is which auxiliary verb is affected. Generally, avere is not affected by this rule, so when it's the auxiliary, the past participle never agrees with the subject, like in this example. Maria ha mangiato. Maria is a feminine singular subject, but the participle mangiato remains unchanged. However, there is a special case that I explained in my object pronoun video in Italian. Agreement can happen with avere only when a direct object pronoun precedes the verb, like saying ho mangiato le mele, le ho mangiate. This agreement happens for a reason, because the pronoun effectively becomes the object's placeholder. This formation changes the agreement focus from the subject to the object, making the participle act like an adjective that modifies it. In essence, it's a grammatical feature reflecting the object's prior placement before the verb, so it creates a connection that requires the participle to match the pronoun's gender and number. This explanation can be tricky to understand, but it's far simpler to comprehend with essere. When essere is the auxiliary, the past participle must agree in gender and number with the subject. Even though it may seem like a lot of rules, historical context can help us see why agreement exists in the first place. When using essere as the auxiliary, Italian past participles agree with the subject. But why? A very important detail that I mentioned in the beginning of the video is that essere is a verb that's about the state or result of an action. Specifically, it's about the change of state of an action, which perfectly explains why essere is used with verbs of movement and reflexive verbs. The purpose of such verbs is to show a change of state, which they all do, and as a result, they make the participle function more like an adjective that describes the subject's state. Grammatically, the state of action is variable, meaning that it can change, and that's why reflexive verbs and verbs of movement are needed with essere. They are about the state of action, showing agreement with the subject in gender and number. On the contrary, this idea is the opposite of avere, because this auxiliary verb is about performed actions. As I said at the beginning, avere emphasizes fixed actions that are invariable, and if they are fixed, there is no need for a participle to agree with the subject, except when direct object pronouns are used. That's why agreement affects essere and not avere, and that's the main difference between the two verbs. Historically, when essere is used, the past participle behaves like an adjective by describing the state of the subject, using verbs that show a change of state. A good example of agreement is in the following chart. Lui è arrivato. Lei è arrivata. Loro sono arrivati. Loro sono arrivate. As we can see, the person and number per sentence are different, using essere and past participles that must agree with the subject. In essence, all of the sentences mean arrived, in the sense that they're all in an arrived state, which is variable. Ultimately, that's why agreement exists with essere. By changing the vowel to match the person and number, we change the participle so that it agrees with the subject, and the same endings apply to any participle. We change the vowel to o, a, I, or e, depending on person and number. After learning the complexity of this topic, we can finish the lesson on the passato prossimo with irregularities in the tense. These concepts may seem like too much, but it's good to know them to fully understand the tense. One concept we should know is that some verbs can take either auxiliary verb, depending on syntactic function, like cambiare, crescere, passare, and finire. This idea is quite irregular in Italian because of transitive verbs that require a direct object to finish the thought and intransitive verbs that do not need anything to express a statement. Essere is used with no direct objects, while avere is needed with direct objects to finish the thought. Another concept is reflexive verbs, which I mentioned before, but here we can see some examples. Reflexive verbs always use essere because they're about a change of state, which is the function of essere. As we know, reflexive pronouns are placed before conjugated verbs, and participles must agree in person and number. Mi sono svegliato. Si sono incontrati. Ci siamo preparate. Another concept is impersonal constructions, where subjects are syntactically empty and the agreement is different. È piovuto. È successo qualcosa. È bastato poco. In such impersonal phrases, the participles stay masculine and singular. Overall, other concepts can be useful in fully understanding the purpose of the passato prossimo, and as a way to conclude the lesson, we can finish with practical examples in all categories of the rules that we've seen. Ho studiato tutta la notte. Abbiamo mangiato bene. Le ragazze hanno parlato molto. Sono arrivato tardi. Maria è partita ieri. I bambini sono tornati a casa. Ho visto il film. Abbiamo fatto un errore. Lei ha detto la verità. Sono venuti a trovarci. È rimasta sola. Mi sono svegliato presto. Si sono incontrati per caso. Ci siamo preparate in fretta. È piovuto tutta la notte. È successo qualcosa di strano. È bastato poco. Le lettere le ho scritte. Il film l'ho visto. In conclusion, this is the purpose of the passato prossimo. It's a compound tense that's made from an auxiliary and a lexical past participle. Agreement depends on the auxiliary and syntax, and irregular participles originate from high-frequency verbs. If you control the auxiliary, the participle, and the agreement, you can control the passato prossimo, and that's how the concept fully works in Italian.